تشکر زیاد. من خیلی خوشحال هستم اینجا هستم. تشکر زیاد خانم رضایی و دوستم عبدالغفور. من میخوایم زیاد در فارسی صحبت میکنیم اگر نمیتوانم. So I'm going to speak in English. So just to start with the situation of Afghans in Europe, this is what I was asked to start with. I guess the most important point to make here is that the situation of Afghans in Europe is very varied. There are many Afghans who have arrived in Europe in the last decades, who have made their lives here, who have studied here, who have got married or brought their wives and have families. So there is a community of Afghans in many European countries, notably in Germany, in Sweden, in Norway, in the UK, for example, but increasingly also in countries like in France and in Italy. So some people have done very well and their children are doing very well. Some Afghans, however, are doing very badly. It's possible through any city in Europe to find Afghans who are forced to sleep outside, who don't have any access to accommodation. In fact, aside from accommodation, another big problem is access to legal advice and access to the protection that is afforded by refugee status. Last week, someone that I have been working with since 2012, so for 10 years, finally got papers. And he had been in the UK for more than 12 years. So for some Afghans, Europe is a very difficult experience. And in between these two extremes are other Afghans who find things difficult for 2, 3, or 4 years, but then ultimately find a way to get papers, although they may not find the life that they had hoped for. There's also a variety in the way that Afghans are treated by different European countries. So some European countries make things extremely difficult for Afghans on arrival. They don't respond quickly. People find it difficult to get accommodation, even in the middle of winter. In other countries, it's relatively easy to get accommodation, but much harder to get status. In other countries, you can arrive, you get taken into the system, you get accommodation, but then you get rejected and you're more likely to be deported. So there's a huge variety across Europe, and this makes it very, very difficult to advise an individual Afghan about what is likely to happen to them. We don't know. There are a number of different policies. And that's because in Europe, there are laws to which all European governments are subject that say what are their duties towards refugees. These laws say that nobody should be returned to their country if they are in danger. However, these laws are interpreted differently, not just by different countries, but within countries, different individuals, different municipalities also interpret the laws differently. And in addition to the laws that are written down, that are argued about in Parliament and become and should govern the process, there are also lots of rules that are not necessarily written down, that people are unfamiliar with, Afghans are unfamiliar with, and that can be interpreted differently by different officials. This makes it also very difficult for people to understand what's happening to them and why. Having said that, I have noticed that some Afghans are really good at working out what is the system and what do I need to do to get through the system. Other Afghans find it incredibly difficult. Most people, whether Afghan or Syrian or Chadian or Somali, need help to negotiate this incredibly complex system. And so they turn very often to Europeans like me for advice. But it is a complex system, and you need to be really wary of this, because even somebody like me who knows the laws doesn't experience those laws the way Afghans do. And so I have in the past advised people that something would be incredibly difficult, and they've managed to achieve it. So you shouldn't trust us 100%. So the main point I want to make about this is that the European asylum system is full of conflict and contradictions, not least because within Europe, there are institutions and people who want to stop Afghans getting in, and there are organizations and people who want to help and who want to insist that European countries should fulfill their duties. Essentially, the law in Europe insists that European governments should offer protection to individuals. Having said that, the policy in Europe is to make sure as few people as possible get that protection. The policy is to make it hard for people to get into the European Union, and I'll talk a bit how it does that in a moment. Once people get into Europe, the policy is to make it as hard as possible for them to get the protection that they want, to get papers. And then the policy is to deport as quickly as possible those people who are rejected. However, it is relatively difficult to deport people for a number of reasons. It's difficult to deport people because deportation is expensive, it's brutal, and it's very hard to organize. You need the cooperation of countries of origin or countries of transit, and very often you need the cooperation of the Afghans who are going to be deported. Because it is difficult, the EU has been unable to deport as many Afghans as it would like. It is deporting. I think it's deporting more than it should, but it's not deporting as many as it would like. And so, because it's difficult to deport people, European governments make it very difficult for people to survive. And they hope that people will give up and go home. And making it difficult isn't just about not giving them accommodation. It isn't about not giving them access to education, not giving them enough food. It's about keeping people in a situation of uncertainty that in some cases drives people mad. It's very difficult to live for years not knowing if you're going to get papers, not knowing if you're going to be able to bring your family to join you, not knowing if you're going to be able to find a job or go to school. And I think that this uncertainty, this keeping people in limbo for years, is one of the cruelest things that the European Union governments do. But because even this is not enough to persuade many people to give up and go home, European governments are also capable of breaking their own rules in order to deport anyone they can, in order to push up the numbers. As a result, we see lots of different kinds of people being deported. Of course, young single men are being deported because the argument is that young single men will easily survive back in Afghanistan. But we also see in some countries, in particular Scandinavian countries, and perhaps Karen and Lena will talk about this, families have been deported with children. We've also seen people who are physically and mentally ill deported. Worryingly, people who have not yet completed their asylum process have been deported, which is illegal. Those who are deported, and most of those who I have met through AMASO and through the work of Abdul Ghafoor, not all, but most, have really struggled when they've returned to Afghanistan. And part of the reason that they have struggled is because almost everybody in Afghanistan knows someone who has successfully gone to Europe, has made a success of their life. When they are deported back, they are seen as failures, as people who must have done something wrong, must be criminal, must be stupid, must be unlucky. But apart from that, a significant number of those who are returned to Afghanistan, and I'm sure everybody here in this meeting knows some of these people, have actually been born outside of Afghanistan and have grown up, for example, in Iran or in Pakistan. So when they're returned to Afghanistan, they are returned to a country that may be their home country, but is a foreign country. And they are no longer familiar with the culture there. It's also, very importantly, a country in conflict. And it's very difficult for somebody who has grown up in Iran or Pakistan and who has spent 2, 3, 5, 10 years in Europe to know how to behave, to know how to survive in Afghanistan. And that's what makes the work of AMASO really important. And Zara, can you tell me how much time I have? Because I don't want to go over and I want to talk about the EU policy.
Oh, yes, you just have 20 minutes.
I have another 5 minutes?
For answering the questions, if we have any question from the audiences.
Okay, I'll go as quick as I can.
Okay.
The European policy on migration as it affects Afghans has been very messy and chaotic for the last few years. Broadly, the idea is to reject as many as possible and to deport as many as possible. Currently, the European Union is discussing its compact on migration. They are arguing that this is a new, coherent, organized system, but actually it's just the same old policies. What they want to do, they're arguing that what they want to do is create partnerships with countries of origin and transit to improve conditions in those countries so that people don't want to leave. Now, that's been the conversation for at least the 30 years that I've been involved in working on asylum, and we have seen no improvement in that area. There has been talk about legal routes to, for example, labor migrate from Afghanistan. That hasn't happened. There is not one single agreement at the moment that allows an Afghan to migrate as a labor migrant. But of course, the main focus is on creating robust, resilient management of external borders. In other words, the argument is, and it's wrong, that the European Union cannot control its external borders, so these have to be made stricter and stronger. There are 300 million people that come into the European Union every year as visitors. Less than 0.005%, so less than a 20th of 1% are people who are rejected. So Europe doesn't have a problem with its external borders, but when you're running an election, it's much easier to create fear and win votes that way. Worryingly, Frontex, which is the border agency and which has been investigated by a number of organizations for illegal pushbacks. In other words, when people leave Turkey and try to get into Greece, Frontex is pushing the boats back and working with, in some cases, the Greek coast guards to do that. This agency, which is hugely problematic and is responsible to almost no one, is about to be given between 5 and 6 billion euros in order to increase its strength to 10,000 border guards in order to stop people getting into the European Union. They're going to strengthen the checks on people when they touch European soil. Health checks. Why should somebody's health status impact on their capacity to claim asylum? Identity checks, security checks, all of these have been promised in the past. And the argument is that Europeans will be able much quicker to identify real asylum seekers from cheats. Again, these things have been promised over years, they haven't happened. Instead, what happens is that it becomes much more difficult for people to actually get into Europe. The rest of the pact is about persuading some European countries to help those countries of first arrival, like Italy and Greece. What we know from European policy is that getting stricter and making the borders harder to cross doesn't stop people coming. What it does do is make it much more difficult, much more expensive and much more dangerous, and is simply a way of allowing the European Union to avoid its responsibility to protect those people who are persecuted, who are in fear of their lives. I'm going to stop there and hope that I've left enough time for questions.
Oh, thank you, Lisa. Just we want to have your views about the joint way forward agreement and its prolongation that as you know, it has its effects on refugees as well, especially Afghans.
So
just shortly, thank you.
That's fine. The Joint Way Forward was an agreement signed in 2016, which Federica Mogherini said had nothing to do with the development aid that was being given to Afghanistan at the time, which was a lie. In fact, the aid was made contingent on Afghanistan signing this agreement. And the agreement essentially said that Afghanistan would work very hard to prevent irregular migration from Afghanistan, and it would agree to take back those people that the European Union wanted to deport back to Afghanistan. After the agreement was signed, it took a little while, it took about a year, but then the numbers of people being deported did increase, but not to the level that the European Union wanted. They wanted to deport up to 80,000. That didn't happen. And it didn't happen because there were good legal reasons why it couldn't happen. It was renewed because, unfortunately, the Afghan government is not in a position to reject the aid from the European Union. So what's really worrying at the moment is the current political situation in Afghanistan means that it is extremely likely that more and more people will be forced to flee if they're able to. And sadly, the European Union is going to make life extremely difficult for those who try to reach the European Union and hope to find safety there.